Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The hallway light didn't flicker on. My fingers found the switch effortlessly, yet the bulb remained obstinately dark. Each step I took resonated with a muted thud, as if the floor itself absorbed the sound. The faint scent of rain drifted through the air, but the windows were tightly shut. I paused, waiting for the familiar hum of the refrigerator, but only eerie silence filled the kitchen. The surfaces were all there, but reflected no light, like shadows pretending to be solid. I reached out, feeling the cool handle of the attic door, and hesitated. It was slightly ajar, an invitation or a warning, I couldn't tell which. The metal was cold against my palm, always cold, even in summer. I remember thinking that when I first touched it, back when everything started, or maybe that's what I think I remember. Memory has a way of reshaping itself, doesn't it? Like water finding new channels through rock. I was a detective then, still am technically, though the badge feels heavier now, like it's made of something denser than brass. The case files are still in my desk drawer, third one down, behind the expired aspirin and broken reading glasses. I've read them so many times the edges have gone soft, the ink slightly smeared from my thumbs. The woman who lived here, I can see her face sometimes, but it shifts. Brown hair, or was it black? She had this way of tilting her head when she listened, like she was trying to catch sounds the rest of us couldn't hear. Her neighbor called it in. Missing person, standard procedure. She always waters her plants at 7, the neighbor had said. Every morning, 7 sharp, but they're dying now. I found that detail in my notes later, written in my own handwriting, but I don't remember writing it. The pen marks look different somehow, pressed deeper into the paper than I usually write. The attic door creaks when you push it, not a sharp sound, more like a sigh. I've heard that creak in my dreams, though I'm not sure if the dreams came before or after I first climbed those stairs. Time has a way of folding back on itself in this house. There were 17 steps to the attic. I counted them twice. The wood was newer than the rest of the house, like someone had replaced them recently. The nails were still bright, not a speck of rust, but the house was old. Everything else showed age, the wallpaper curling at the seams, the hardwood floors worn smooth in the high-traffic areas. We renovated last spring, she had told me during the interview, or someone told me. The voice in my memory is clear, but I can't quite place the face that goes with it. Had to fix the stairs, safety issue. Safety, the word echoes strangely in my mind. I found a photograph up there, tucked between 2 boxes of Christmas decorations. The woman in the picture was smiling, but her eyes looked tired. Behind her, barely visible in the background, was a man. His face was turned away, just a profile, a shadow really. I stared at that photograph for a long time, trying to make sense of the shadows. The missing woman's sister came to identify her belongings. She had the same way of tilting her head, the same gesture of brushing hair behind her ear. But when I showed her the photograph, she frowned. "That's not her," she said. Then after a pause, "Well, it looks like her, but something's different." I asked what she meant. "The smile," she said. "She never smiled like that, too wide, too forced." I looked at the photograph again. The smile did seem strange now that she mentioned it. Like someone had told the woman to smile, and she was trying too hard to comply. The sister left that afternoon. I never saw her again, though I called the number she gave me several times. The line was always busy, or maybe disconnected. The sound was hard to distinguish. In my notes I wrote, "Sister confirms identity of belongings but questions photograph authenticity." The handwriting looks like mine, but I don't remember forming those particular words. They feel foreign in my mouth when I read them aloud. The house stayed empty for weeks. The neighbor continued to call, reporting strange sounds, lights that shouldn't be on, cars in the driveway that disappeared when she looked again. I drove by sometimes, usually late at night when the streets were empty. The windows were always dark, but once I thought I saw movement behind the curtains on the second floor. I started having trouble sleeping. Not insomnia exactly, more like my sleep was fragmented, broken into pieces that didn't quite fit together. I would wake up with the taste of dust in my mouth and the feeling that I had been somewhere else, somewhere important, but I couldn't remember where. The case files multiplied, reports I didn't remember writing, witness statements I didn't remember taking. The woman's face appeared in dozens of photographs, but each image showed subtle differences. The shape of her nose, the color of her eyes, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, as if someone was adjusting the details, fine-tuning a portrait that never quite looked right. I found myself returning to the house. Not officially, the case had been transferred to another detective, someone with fresher eyes and steadier hands, but I couldn't stay away. The attic door called to me, that cold metal handle and the 17 steps beyond. Each time I climbed those stairs, I discovered something new. A box I hadn't noticed before, a photograph tucked behind a different set of decorations, a piece of paper with handwriting that looked almost like mine but not quite. The discoveries felt significant, but their meaning slipped away like smoke. The other detective, I never learned his name, or maybe I forgot it, closed the case eventually. Voluntary disappearance, the report concluded. Subject likely relocated to avoid personal conflicts. The language was clean, bureaucratic, final. But I kept the key to the house. I don't remember taking it, but it appeared on my keychain one morning, nestled between my car key and the key to my apartment. The metal was the same temperature as the attic door handle, always cold, regardless of the weather. The woman's plants did die eventually. The neighbor stopped watering them after the first week. I watched them wither from the kitchen window, their leaves turning brown and brittle. But sometimes when I visit the house now, they look green again, healthy, as if someone has been caring for them. I wonder if the woman ever really lived here at all. The more I think about it, the more the details seem constructed, assembled from fragments of other cases, other missing persons, other empty houses with cold door handles and creaking stairs. But the photograph is real. I carry it with me now in my wallet behind my driver's license. The woman's forced smile has become familiar, almost comforting. The shadow man in the background remains turned away, his face forever hidden, forever unknowable. Sometimes I catch myself tilting my head when I listen, trying to catch sounds that others can't hear. The gesture feels natural, inherited, like muscle memory from someone else's life. The attic door is still ajar. I left it that way, an invitation or a warning. The 17 steps wait in darkness, leading to boxes of Christmas decorations and photographs that shift when no one is looking. The house breathes around them, patient and persistent, holding its secrets like a closed fist. I am no longer certain what I was investigating, or if there was ever anything to investigate at all. The case files blur together, witness statements from people who might never have existed, evidence that points in every direction and no direction at all. But I keep returning. The key is cold in my pocket, the metal handle colder still. The stairs creak their wooden sigh, and somewhere in the darkness above, the truth waits. Not the truth I was looking for that vanished long ago, if it ever existed, but a different truth, stranger and more elusive, built from shadows and forced smiles, and the sound of footsteps on stairs that were replaced for safety reasons no one can quite remember. The woman is gone, she was always gone, perhaps, but her absence has weight, substance, presence. It fills the house like water, seeping into corners and crevices, changing the shape of everything it touches. I close my eyes and listen for sounds that aren't there. The hum of a refrigerator that doesn't run, the whisper of rain against windows that are always shut, the soft thud of footsteps on floors that absorb all sound. In the darkness behind my eyelids, the woman tilts her head and smiles that too wide smile. The shadow man remains turned away, but I sense he is listening too, waiting for something we both know will never come. The case is closed, but the door remains ajar, an invitation, a warning the difference has ceased to matter. Equals. Story 2. The morning sun filtered gently through the lace curtains, casting intricate patterns across the wooden floor. The clock ticked methodically, its echo resonating in the stillness of the room. On the mantelpiece, a solitary candle flickered faintly, its flame unusually restless in the absence of a breeze. There was a scent of lavender mingling with something else, something metallic and out of place. The calmness of the quaint sitting room was broken only by the creak of a floorboard from the hallway, a sound that shouldn't have been heard in an empty house. I touch the edge of the photograph now, months later, and the paper feels different, thinner, as if time has worn away more than just the memory. The woman in the frame stares back with eyes that seem to hold questions I never thought to ask when I first walked into that room, when I first heard that creak. The detective work was supposed to be routine, a missing person case that felt more like a formality than an investigation. She'd been gone 3 days when her neighbor called it in. 3 days of silence from someone who apparently never stayed quiet for more than 3 hours at a time. Or was it 4 days? The report says 3, but I remember the neighbor mentioning 4. Memory plays tricks when you're trying to reconstruct something that might never have had a solid foundation to begin with. The metallic scent, I keep coming back to that. Copper maybe, or iron, something that didn't belong in a room where everything else whispered of careful domesticity. The lavender sachets tucked into every corner, the way the morning light seemed choreographed to fall just so across the hardwood, everything deliberate except for that smell. She was particular about scents, the neighbor had said, standing on the porch, wringing her hands in a dish towel that smelled of bleach. Never liked anything harsh, said it gave her headaches. But which neighbor said this, the one from the left side of the house or the right? I have 2 conversations in my head, both equally vivid, both claiming the same space in my memory. In one version, she's elderly with silver hair pulled back severely. In the other, she's middle-aged with paint under her fingernails and a voice that carries too far. The floorboard creaked again while I stood there that first morning. I remember turning toward the hallway, expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows. The house breathed around me, settling into its emptiness the way old houses do, but the creak felt deliberate, weighted. I walked through each room methodically. That's what we're trained to do. Look for signs of struggle, for things out of place, for the story the space wants to tell. But every room felt curated, perfect, like a museum exhibit of how someone wanted to be remembered rather than how they actually lived. The bedroom upstairs, the bed made with hospital corners, not a wrinkle in the pale blue comforter, but the pillow on the left side held the faint impression of a head, just one pillow disturbed while the other remained plump and untouched. She slept alone then, or wanted it to appear that way. In the bathroom, a single toothbrush in the holder, medications lined up in the medicine cabinet with military precision, prescriptions for anxiety, for sleep, for something I couldn't pronounce, all current, all necessary according to the dates. But there was a second toothbrush in the drawer beneath the sink, pushed far back behind spare tubes of toothpaste and a bottle of mouthwash that looked like it had never been opened. Blue bristles, well used, the kind men prefer, with the wider handle. I made a note of it, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. The kitchen held the same careful contradictions. One coffee mug in the sink, lipstick stain on the rim, but two coffee rings on the counter beside the machine, overlapping circles that suggested habit, routine, the kind of marks that build up over time when you always set your cup in the same spot, when someone else always sets theirs right next to yours. She lived alone, the neighbor insisted, or maybe that was the landlord, someone official, someone who would know, kept to herself mostly, quiet type. But the grocery receipts tucked into a drawer told a different story, or seemed to: 2 steaks, 2 bottles of wine, quantities that suggested company, meals shared, unless she was the type to buy in bulk, to freeze what she couldn't finish, unless I was reading intention into coincidence. The receipts were dated sporadically over several months, no pattern I could discern, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes clustered together like someone had been stocking up for anticipated visitors. I photographed everything, that's protocol, but looking at the images later, they seemed to show a different house entirely. In the pictures, the rooms looked smaller, more cramped. The careful arrangements appeared forced rather than natural. The camera captured what my eyes had missed or chosen to ignore. The candle on the mantelpiece flickered throughout my entire visit. I timed it once, counted the seconds between each restless dance of the flame. No pattern there either, just the persistent sense that something was disturbing the air in ways I couldn't detect. I blew it out before I left, then wondered, driving away, who had lit it in the first place, and why it had been burning in a house that was supposed to be empty. The case file grew thicker over the following weeks, but not more illuminating. Bank records showed regular deposits, modest withdrawals, nothing suspicious. Credit card statements revealed purchases at grocery stores, pharmacies, a bookstore downtown. The transactions painted the picture of someone living a quiet, predictable life. But there were cash withdrawals too, small amounts taken out weekly on the same day, always on Wednesdays, always the same branch, always the same time according to the timestamps, $50 like clockwork for months. Maybe she had a cleaning lady, someone suggested during one of our team meetings, or paid cash for something regular, groceries maybe. But the grocery receipts were all credit card transactions, and $50 seemed like too little for housekeeping, too much for coffee money. I drove by the house again last week, or was it yesterday? Time has a way of folding in on itself when you're trying to solve something that might not have a solution. The for sale sign in the front yard looked weathered, like it had been there longer than the few months since she disappeared. The new real estate agent, the third one, according to the sign, mentioned that showings had been difficult. Prospective buyers complained about the smell, not unpleasant exactly, but persistent, something they couldn't identify but couldn't ignore. Lavender, I told her, there are sachets throughout the house. But she shook her head. We removed all those weeks ago, had the place professionally cleaned twice. It's something else now, something underneath. I asked to walk through again, told her it was related to the ongoing investigation, which was technically true even though the case had been moved to inactive status. No evidence of foul play, no leads worth pursuing, just another person who decided to disappear, which happens more often than people want to believe. The house felt different, empty of furniture, smaller somehow. The rooms echoed with our footsteps, but underneath that, the same settling sounds, the same creaks from floorboards that seemed to respond to weight that wasn't there. The metallic smell was stronger now, or maybe I was more attuned to it, knowing to look for what didn't belong. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the house had absorbed something over time and was now slowly releasing it back into the air. In the basement, which I hadn't thoroughly explored during my initial investigation, I found the source of the Wednesday cash withdrawals. A small, discreet room behind the furnace, fitted with a lock that required a key I didn't have. The real estate agent claimed not to know what it contained, said the previous owner had kept it secured and never mentioned what she stored there. Storage, she said, but her tone suggested she was guessing. Important papers, maybe, valuables. The door was solid wood, painted white to match the basement walls, but the paint was newer, applied over something darker that showed through in thin lines where the brush strokes hadn't quite covered. I ran my fingers along the edge, feeling forgive in the frame for any weakness that might allow a glimpse inside. The lock was substantial, professional grade, the kind you'd use for something that mattered, not the simple privacy lock you'd expect on a storage closet. This was meant to keep people out, not just to keep a door closed. I requested a warrant to search the locked room. The request was denied. Insufficient cause, no evidence of criminal activity. The woman was an adult who had every right to disappear if she chose to. The locked door could contain anything or nothing. Without probable cause, it would remain sealed. But I dream about that room now. In my sleep, I have the key. I turn it in the lock and the door swings open to reveal. What? The dreams never get that far. I always wake up at the moment of revelation, with the metallic smell sharp in my nostrils and the sound of a floorboard creaking somewhere in my own house. The neighbor with the paint-stained fingers, or was it the silver-haired one, called me last month, said she'd been thinking about our conversation, remembering details she'd forgotten to mention. How the missing woman had started having groceries delivered instead of shopping herself. How there had been a man around occasionally, someone she'd never seen clearly but whose presence she'd sensed. Felt like someone was watching, she said. Not in a threatening way exactly, more like protective, like someone was keeping an eye on things. But when I pressed for details, for anything concrete, she became vague. Maybe she'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the way shadows fell between the houses, creating the impression of movement where there was none. I pulled the phone records again, scanned them for patterns I might have missed the first time. Most calls were brief, routine. Doctors' offices, the pharmacy, a few numbers that traced back to family members in other states. But there were also calls to a number that had been disconnected, a landline that had been terminated the same week she disappeared. The phone company couldn't tell me who had owned the number. Privacy policies, they said, data retention limits. The information had been purged when the account was closed. But I found the address associated with that number in an old directory, a small apartment across town in a complex that had since been demolished to make way for a shopping center. Another dead end, another thread that led nowhere but left me with the persistent feeling that I was missing something obvious. The photograph on the mantelpiece, the one I keep touching now, showed her at what looked like a family gathering. She stood slightly apart from the group, smiling but not quite connected. Behind her, partially obscured by shadow, was the figure of a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face turned away from the camera. I had the photo enhanced, tried to bring out details in the shadowed areas, but technology can only do so much with an image that was never meant to capture what you're looking for. The figure remained indistinct, more suggestion than substance. The family members I contacted didn't remember the man in the photograph, said they'd never known her to be involved with anyone seriously, that she was private about her personal life. But their responses felt rehearsed, as if they'd agreed beforehand on what to say and what to keep to themselves. She was happy, her sister insisted during our phone conversation. Whatever happened, she chose it. She wouldn't have left unless she wanted to. But there was something in her voice, a hesitation that suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. When I asked about the man in the photograph, she claimed not to see anyone, said the shadow I was pointing to was probably just a trick of the light. The case remains open but inactive, filed away with hundreds of others where the trail went cold, where the questions outnumbered the answers, where the truth remained just out of reach. But I keep the photograph on my desk, keep touching its edges, keep staring into those eyes that seem to hold secrets I'm not clever enough to decode. Sometimes I drive by the house, even though it sold last month to a young couple who plan to renovate. They've already started painting, changing the color scheme from the muted pastels she preferred to something brighter, more contemporary. Soon it will look nothing like the place where I first encountered that metallic smell, that restless candle flame, that creak from an empty hallway. But I wonder if they'll find the key to the basement room, if they'll discover what she kept locked away, what was worth $50 every Wednesday to maintain. If they'll understand the significance of 2 coffee rings on a counter, of a second toothbrush hidden in a drawer, of grocery receipts that suggested a life shared rather than lived alone. Or maybe there was never anything to find. Maybe the mystery exists only in my need to see patterns where none exist, to find meaning in coincidences, to believe that every disappearance has a story worth solving. The metallic smell still clings to my memory, sharp and out of place. Sometimes I catch a whiff of it in unexpected moments, walking through a parking garage, opening an old filing cabinet, standing in my own kitchen early in the morning when the light falls just right across the floor. And I think about that floorboard creaking under invisible weight in a house that was supposed to be empty. About a candle that flickered without wind, about lavender sachets that couldn't quite mask whatever else lingered in those carefully arranged rooms. The truth feels close sometimes, like something I could touch if I just reached a little farther, looked a little harder, asked the right question of the right person. But then it slips away again, leaving me with fragments that don't quite fit together, with a photograph of a woman whose eyes seem to follow me, with the persistent sense that I've missed something important. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the questions matter more than the answers, the search more than the finding. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, to haunt the edges of our understanding, to remind us that not everything can be explained or categorized or filed away. But I keep the photograph anyway, keep touching its worn edges, keep wondering about that shadowy figure, about Wednesday withdrawals, about the sound of footsteps in an empty house. Keep listening for the creak of a floorboard that shouldn't bear any weight. Equals. Story 3. I had just wiped the dust from my hands. The grit clung to my palms longer than usual, as if it refused to be forgotten. The air was heavy and tasted metallic, hinting at secrets the walls held close. A faint creak echoed, not unlike the sound of an old house settling into itself. My skin tingled, an unfamiliar sensation, as though touched by a whisper of something unsettled. In that silence, the ground felt uneasy beneath me, like it was waiting to reveal what lay buried just beneath the surface. The nausea comes in waves now, rolling through my stomach like a tide that never quite recedes. I've been carrying this feeling for weeks, maybe months. Time has become elastic, stretching and contracting without my permission. Sometimes I wake up and my mouth tastes like copper pennies, and I know I've been grinding my teeth again, working my jaw against some invisible resistance. There was a basement, I remember that much. The smell of damp concrete and something else, something organic that had been left too long in darkness. My footsteps echoed differently down there, as if the sound was being absorbed by the walls themselves. The light bulb swayed on its cord, casting shadows that moved independently of my movements. But that's not right. The basement came later, didn't it? Or maybe it came first. My memory keeps rearranging itself, shuffling the deck of what happened and when. I find myself staring at my hands throughout the day, turning them over, examining the lines in my palms as if they might spell out the truth in some ancient script I've forgotten how to read. She was wearing blue, I'm certain of that detail, though I can't say why it matters. Blue like the color of deep water, the kind that hides things in its depths. Her voice had a particular quality, like wind through dry leaves, rustling with secrets. When she laughed, it sounded hollow, echoing from somewhere far away even though she was standing right beside me. The tool felt foreign in my grip, heavy, cold. The weight of it surprised me as if I'd expected it to be lighter, more manageable. My fingers wrapped around the handle, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could feel so significant. The metal was smooth, worn down by countless other hands that had held it before mine. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, or behind myself. The sequence keeps slipping away from me like water through cupped palms. Sometimes I think the basement was empty when I first went down there. Other times I remember it being full of things, objects covered in sheets like ghosts waiting to be unveiled. The detective asked me about the shovel. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they never left my face while he spoke. I told him I didn't remember a shovel, which wasn't entirely a lie. Memory and truth have become strange bedfellows in my mind, sleeping together but dreaming different dreams. There were flowers in the yard, roses, I think, though their color keeps changing in my recollection. Sometimes they're red, sometimes white, sometimes a sickly yellow that reminds me of old teeth. The thorns caught my clothes as I passed by them, tiny pinpricks that drew blood without my noticing until later, when I found the small dark stains on my shirt. The ground was softer than I expected. Rich, dark earth that gave way easily under pressure. I remember being surprised by this, though I can't recall what I had been expecting instead. My knees pressed into the soil, and I could feel the dampness seeping through the fabric of my pants. There were worms, pale and segmented, writhing away from the light. She stopped talking. That's when I knew something had changed, though I couldn't say what. The silence stretched between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. Her eyes reflected the overhead light, two small mirrors that showed me nothing but my own distorted face staring back. The washing machine ran for 3 cycles that night. I stood in the laundry room, watching the clothes tumble through the glass door, hypnotized by the repetitive motion. The water turned colors, cycling through shades I didn't want to examine too closely. My hands shook as I added more detergent, then more bleach, then more detergent again. But the stains wouldn't come out. They never do they? Some things sink too deep, become part of the fabric itself. I threw the clothes away eventually, stuffed them into garbage bags, and left them by the curb on collection day. Watched from my window as the truck carried them away, though I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. The basement door was always locked after that. I installed 3 separate deadbolts, each one a different size and weight. The keys live in my pocket now, a small constellation of metal that jingles when I walk. Sometimes I catch myself touching them, running my fingers over their jagged edges like a rosary of guilt. She had small hands, I remember that now, though I'm not sure why the detail matters. Her fingers were delicate, almost childlike, with short nails painted a color that reminded me of dried blood. When she gestured while speaking, her hands moved like birds, quick and nervous, never quite settling in one place. The phone rang 17 times before I answered it. I counted each ring, marking them off in my mind like a prisoner marking days on a cell wall. When I finally picked up, there was only breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying to communicate through rhythm alone. There was mud under my fingernails for weeks afterward. I scrubbed until my fingers bled, used brushes and picks and chemicals that burned my skin, but traces of it remained. Dark crescents that reminded me of tiny smiles, mocking and persistent. I started wearing gloves everywhere, even to bed, telling people I had developed some kind of skin condition. The roses died, all of them overnight, as if some invisible poison had swept through the garden. Their petals turned black and fell like tears onto the disturbed earth below. I left them there, withered and accusatory, until the neighbors began to complain about the smell. She asked me about the basement once early on, before everything changed. Her voice was casual, conversational, but her eyes held a sharpness that made my skin crawl. I told her it was just storage space, nothing interesting, but she kept pressing, asking about the smell, the sounds, the reasons I always kept it locked. The detective came back 3 times. Each visit felt like a slow dance we were both learning the steps to, circling around the truth without ever quite touching it. He asked about times, dates, locations, but my answers kept shifting, rearranging themselves even as I spoke them aloud. Truth became a moving target, and I was shooting with my eyes closed. I dream about the shovel now. It appears in landscapes of my sleeping mind, standing upright in fields of black earth like some kind of monument. Sometimes it's clean, gleaming in artificial light. Other times it's covered in substances I don't want to identify, dripping with evidence of its purpose. The basement flooded, that's what I told the insurance company anyway. Water damage, they wrote in their report, cause unknown. They never went down there to look, just took my word for it and cut me a check for the cleanup. I used the money to buy concrete, bag after bag, enough to fill every corner and crevice until the space was solid and smooth and silent. Her laugh still echoes sometimes, bouncing off the walls of my memory like a ball thrown too hard in a small room. It starts as something almost musical, then deteriorates into something else, something that makes my teeth ache and my hands shake. I've tried to forget the sound, but it lives in my bones now, part of my skeleton's song. The ground remembers everything. That's what my grandmother used to say, though I never understood what she meant until now. Earth holds secrets in its dark embrace, nurturing them like seeds that will never sprout. Every footstep leaves an impression. Every drop of moisture sinks deep and spreads like whispered confessions. There were 3 shovels in the garage. I'm certain of that detail, though the detective seemed skeptical when I mentioned it. 3 different sizes, 3 different purposes, hanging on hooks like sleeping bats. One for snow, one for gardening, one for things that required deeper digging. The smell never fully went away. It lingered in the corners of rooms, hiding behind furniture and inside closets like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. I burned candles, used air fresheners, opened every window in the house, but it persisted, patient and accusatory, waiting for acknowledgement. She was afraid of basements, mentioned it once, laughing nervously as she explained her childhood fear of dark underground spaces. Said they reminded her of graves, of being buried alive, of secrets that should stay hidden. I filed that information away without thinking, storing it in some dark corner of my mind where it waited to become useful. The concrete is smooth now, perfect and unmarked. I run my hands over its surface sometimes, feeling for imperfections, for signs that something lies beneath. But it reveals nothing, keeps its secrets locked away in artificial stone, silent as a tomb. My hands remember the weight of things I can't quite name. Muscle memory lives in my fingers, in the calluses that formed and faded, in the way my grip adjusts automatically to handles and tools and objects that exist now only in the shadows of my recollection. Sometimes I wake up with my hands clenched into fists, fighting battles my conscious mind has forgotten. The roses are growing back, new shoots pushing through the disturbed earth, reaching toward light with a determination that unsettles me. Their roots must go deep, deeper than I thought possible, finding nourishment in soil that should be barren. I've considered digging them up, but my hands shake when I reach for the shovel. She never came back, that's what I tell myself anyway, though sometimes I hear footsteps in the basement, muffled by concrete but persistent as heartbeats. The sound echoes through the house at night, rhythmic and purposeful, as if someone is walking in circles, searching for something they've lost. The dust on my hands feels different now, heavier somehow, weighted with significance I can't quite grasp. It clings to my skin like memory, refusing to be washed away completely, leaving traces that remind me of tasks completed and secrets buried. Sometimes I think the dust is trying to tell me something, spelling out words in the grit that accumulates in the lines of my palms. But memory is unreliable, isn't it? It changes shape like smoke, drifting and reforming, showing us what we need to see rather than what actually happened. The basement might have been empty all along. The shovel might have been used only for gardening. The roses might have died from natural causes. The ground beneath my feet still feels unsteady, though shifting and settling as if something deep below is trying to find its way to the surface. I walk carefully now, testing each step, listening for the hollow sounds that might indicate empty spaces waiting to be filled or full spaces waiting to be discovered. Equals. Story 4. I stood by the window, aware of the drape that no longer hung straight. The air seemed to vibrate gently, as if holding its breath, while outside branches swayed with a rhythm that didn't match the wind. A clock somewhere behind me ticked slowly, each beat a reminder of seconds stretching into infinity. I watched the fabric ripple slightly, though the window was shut, its glass cold and unyielding. Shadows danced along the edges of the room, teasing at corners hidden from view. The curtain shifted again, and beneath its fold, a sliver of paper peeked out, where none had been before. The paper was white, clean-edged, deliberate. I knew without touching it that someone had placed it there while I slept, or perhaps while I stood in the kitchen making coffee, lost in the steam rising from my cup. The certainty of this knowledge unsettled me more than the paper itself. How long had I been watching for signs like this? How long had I been expecting them? My fingers found the paper's edge before my mind decided to reach for it. The texture was ordinary printer paper, the kind found in any office or home, but the weight of it felt different, heavier somehow, as if the words written on it carried more than ink. I unfolded it slowly, aware that this moment would divide my understanding into before and after. The handwriting was familiar in the way that makes your stomach drop, not because you recognize it immediately, but because recognition creeps in like cold water, starting at your ankles and rising. The letters were careful, measured, written by someone who wanted to be understood completely. "You know what you saw," it said, "nothing more." But I didn't know what I had seen. That was the problem that had been eating at me, the reason I found myself standing at windows, watching drapes for movement that shouldn't exist. The reason I had started questioning every shadow, every sound that didn't announce itself properly. It began with the neighbor's dog, or perhaps it began before that, with the way the mailman had started looking at me when he delivered letters not quite meeting my eyes, but not avoiding them either. A look that suggested shared knowledge of something I couldn't name. The dog had stopped barking at the usual things, delivery trucks, joggers, the family of raccoons that emerged each evening to raid garbage cans. Instead, it barked at empty spaces, at corners where nothing moved, at windows where no faces appeared. I had mentioned this to the neighbor once, casually, while we both retrieved our morning papers. She had smiled in that particular way people smile when they're deciding how much truth to share. "Dogs see things we don't," she said, and then added something that made me pause. "But sometimes they see things we pretend not to." The paper in my hand seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. I read the words again, though they hadn't changed. "You know what you saw." The certainty in those letters mocked my uncertainty. What had I seen? When had I seen it? The questions multiplied like reflections in opposing mirrors, stretching endlessly in both directions. There had been the evening when I noticed the light in the house across the street. Not unusual in itself, lights appear in windows constantly, unremarkably. But this light had been different. It didn't illuminate anything. Instead, it seemed to absorb the darkness around it, creating a space that was neither bright nor dim, but something else entirely. I had watched it for what felt like hours, waiting for movement, for a shadow to pass across it, for any sign of the life that must exist behind it. No shadow came. The light simply existed, steady and purposeful, until suddenly it didn't. The transition from light to darkness happened without my noticing, as if my attention had been deliberately redirected. When I looked back, the window was black, reflecting nothing. I had convinced myself that I had imagined the strangeness of it. Lights turn on and off. People move through rooms without casting shadows visible from across the street. These were reasonable explanations for reasonable observations, but the reasonableness felt forced, like clothing that doesn't quite fit but must be worn anyway. The note crinkled slightly as my grip tightened. Someone else had seen what I had seen, or thought I had seen, or wanted me to believe I had seen. The distinction mattered, though I couldn't articulate why. The handwriting suggested intimacy, not the intimacy of affection, but of observation. Someone had been watching me watch. I moved away from the window, carrying the paper like evidence of a crime I couldn't identify. The house felt different now, as if the note had shifted the balance of something I hadn't known was precarious. Rooms that had been familiar for years now seemed to hold their breath, waiting for me to notice what had always been there but had remained invisible. In the kitchen, I made coffee again, though I had already had coffee. The ritual of grinding beans, measuring water, waiting for the machine to finish its work provided a framework for thinking, but my thoughts refused to organize themselves logically. Instead, they moved in circles, returning always to the same questions. What had I seen? When had I seen it? Who else had been watching? The coffee tasted different than it had that morning. Not bad exactly, but altered in some subtle way that made me question whether I had changed or the coffee had changed, or whether change itself was something I could no longer trust myself to recognize accurately. I found myself back at the window without remembering the decision to return. The drape hung differently now, though I couldn't say how. The paper was still in my hand, its edges softened by my handling. Outside, the branches moved with the same rhythm that didn't match the wind, but now the discordance seemed intentional, choreographed. The neighbor's dog was in its yard, sitting perfectly still, staring at something I couldn't see. Its attention was absolute, unwavering, the kind of focus that suggests understanding rather than mere curiosity. I followed its gaze but found nothing, no movement, no unusual shadows, no lights that absorbed darkness instead of dispelling it. But the absence of something visible didn't mean the absence of something real. I had learned this gradually through accumulated moments of noticing what wasn't there. The mailman who no longer whistled, the jogger who had changed her route, the family of raccoons that had stopped appearing altogether. Each absence was small, explicable, forgettable. Together, they formed a pattern that felt significant without being interpretable. The dog turned its head and looked directly at me, not at the window or the house, but at me specifically, as if it could see through glass and walls and the careful barriers I had constructed between myself and the world's scrutiny. Its expression was neither friendly nor hostile, but knowing. It held my gaze for a moment that stretched longer than moments should, then turned back to watching whatever had captured its attention initially. I stepped back from the window, suddenly aware that being seen might be as dangerous as seeing. The thought arrived fully formed, as if it had been waiting in my mind for permission to surface. Dangerous to whom? Dangerous how? The questions felt less important than the certainty that preceded them. The house settled around me with small sounds, the refrigerator cycling on, floorboards adjusting to temperature changes, the distant hum of electrical current moving through wires hidden in walls. These sounds had always been present, but now they seemed like a language I was only beginning to understand. Each creak and whisper might be communication, might be warning, might be nothing more than the ordinary conversation between a house and time. I unfolded the paper again, though I knew what it said. The handwriting looked different in the kitchen light, less familiar, more deliberate. The ink seemed darker, as if it had been applied with greater pressure than I had initially noticed. You know what you saw. The words carried weight beyond their meaning, like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that expanded far beyond their point of impact. What had I seen? The question had become a refrain, a prayer, a curse. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the moment when seeing had become significant, when observation had transformed from passive reception to active participation in something larger and more complex than I had understood. There had been the morning when I woke to find my front door unlocked. Not open, just unlocked, the deadbolt turned to the position that meant anyone could enter. I lived alone, had lived alone for years, and had developed habits around security that were as automatic as breathing. I locked doors without thinking, checked them without conscious decision. Finding the door unlocked was like discovering that gravity had stopped working, not impossible, perhaps, but so contrary to expectation that it demanded explanation. I had searched for rational causes. Perhaps I had been distracted, preoccupied, had forgotten to complete the ritual of securing the house before sleep. Perhaps the lock mechanism was failing, allowing the bolt to slip from engaged to disengaged through some mechanical flaw. Perhaps I had unlocked the door myself in some half-sleeping state, responding to a dream or a sound that had seemed to require investigation. But none of these explanations felt adequate. They addressed the mechanism without acknowledging the meaning. Someone had been in my house, or someone had wanted me to believe someone had been in my house, or someone had wanted me to question my own reliability as a witness to my own life. The distinction mattered, though I couldn't say why. I had begun checking the door more frequently after that, not just at bedtime, but throughout the evening, and again in the middle of the night when sleep proved elusive. Each check confirmed that the lock was engaged, that the house was secure, that my habits remained intact. But the checking itself became a kind of evidence that something had changed, that security could no longer be assumed, that the simple act of living alone in a familiar house had become complicated by possibilities I didn't want to name. The paper rustled as I folded it again. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen, like an announcement of my presence to listeners I couldn't identify. I moved more carefully after that, aware that every action might be observed, recorded, interpreted by someone whose intentions remained opaque. The afternoon light shifted as I stood there, creating new patterns of shadow and illumination across the kitchen floor. I watched these patterns change, noting how they revealed aspects of familiar objects that I had never noticed before. The chair by the table cast a shadow that resembled a figure in profile. The coffee maker's silhouette suggested something organic, almost alive. The patterns were beautiful and unsettling, like discovering that a language you thought you understood contained meanings you had never suspected. Time moved differently now, or perhaps I moved differently through time. Minutes stretched and compressed without warning, making it difficult to maintain a consistent sense of duration or sequence. I might stand at the window for what felt like hours, only to discover that the light had barely changed, or I might glance away for what seemed like seconds and find that evening had arrived without my noticing its approach. The note in my pocket felt warm against my fingers, as if it were generating its own heat. I knew this was impossible. Paper doesn't create warmth, ink doesn't pulse with life, handwriting doesn't carry the body temperature of the hand that formed it. But knowledge and experience had begun to diverge in ways that made certainty increasingly difficult to maintain. I returned to the window as the day began its transition toward evening. The drape hung as it always had, or as it had always appeared to hang. But appearance and reality had become complicated concepts, requiring careful consideration before acceptance. The neighbor's dog was gone from its yard, though I hadn't seen it leave. The branches outside moved with their familiar rhythm that matched no wind I could feel or understand. And there in the house across the street, the light appeared again. Not gradually, not with the warm progression of a bulb being turned on, but suddenly, completely, as if it had always been there and I had simply failed to notice it until that moment. The light that absorbed darkness instead of dispelling it, that illuminated nothing while somehow making everything visible. I watched it with the same intensity the dog had brought to its vigil, understanding finally that watching was not passive observation, but active participation in something that required witnesses to exist. The light watched back, or seemed to, or made me feel as if I were being seen with the same intensity I brought to seeing. The paper in my pocket grew warmer, or I imagined it did, or the distinction between warmth and imagination ceased to matter. "You know what you saw," it had said, and standing there in the gathering evening, I began to understand that knowing and seeing were not the same thing, that truth and fact could diverge in ways that made both more complex and less reliable than I had ever suspected. The light across the street pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat made visible. Then it was gone, leaving behind not darkness, but the absence of something that had never quite been light to begin with. I stood by the window, aware of the drape that no longer hung straight, watching shadows dance along the edges of the room, waiting for the next sign that would confirm what I was beginning to understand I had always known. The paper beneath the curtain's fold crinkled softly as the fabric moved in the still air, and I realized that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, but lived with, carried like secrets that grew heavier and more necessary with each repetition of their telling. Equals equals equals. Story 5. The switch didn't flicker. Fingers brushed the wall, expecting the click, but nothing disrupted the quiet. Shoes brushed over the carpets, yet the gentle thump of settling dust never echoed back. The night pressed through the window, dense and unmoving, like a portrait instead of a scene. The key turned in the lock with too much ease, swinging open to embrace an unyielding void. I paused, feeling the air heavy and refusing itself. The mirror at the end of the hall wavered, reflecting not a familiar face, but a shadow that held no movement. The coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, still warm. I remember thinking about that later, much later, when the detective asked about small details, steam rising from untouched liquid, the newspaper folded to the crossword half finished, 7 across, absence of sound, 6 letters. I never learned the answer. She always finished her crosswords. There's a photograph I keep returning to. We're standing by the lake, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her smile seems different now, knowing what I know, or think I know. The way her fingers press into my jacket, was that affection or something else? The camera captured a moment, but moments lie. They freeze truth before it has time to reveal itself. The first time I noticed the car, it was parked 3 houses down. Dark sedan, windows tinted. Nothing unusual about it except how it appeared in the same spot for days. I started keeping track. Monday morning there, Tuesday evening gone, Wednesday back again. Like a pattern someone was trying to establish without making it obvious. I should have asked her about it then. The voicemail played while I stood in that hallway, still staring at my reflection that wasn't quite right. Her voice, recorded hours before, maybe minutes. Time becomes elastic when you're trying to reconstruct events. I'm going to the store, need anything. Ordinary words carrying extraordinary weight now. Background noise I couldn't identify, a door closing, footsteps that might not have been hers. Memory is unreliable, I know this. The mind fills gaps with what makes sense, not necessarily what happened. But I remember the way she looked at me that morning over her coffee cup, like she was memorizing my face, like she knew something I didn't. The drawer in her desk was slightly open, just enough to notice if you were looking. Inside, papers I'd never seen, bank statements showing withdrawals I couldn't account for, a business card for a lawyer I'd never heard her mention, phone numbers written in her careful handwriting, no names attached, just digits that could lead anywhere to anyone. I called one of them. A man answered. His voice was familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. Not someone I knew, but someone I should have known. He hung up when I said her name. The silence that followed felt accusatory, like I'd revealed something I wasn't supposed to understand. The police officer had kind eyes. She asked gentle questions while taking notes in a small pad. Had there been any arguments, changes in behavior, signs of distress? I answered honestly, or thought I did. But honesty becomes complicated when you realize you might not have been paying attention to the right things. She seemed fine, I told her. Normal. But what is normal? The way she'd started locking her phone, how she'd begun taking calls in the other room, the new clothes I'd never seen her buy, small changes that accumulate like snowfall, unnoticed until the landscape transforms completely. The basement smelled different, musty in a way it hadn't before. I went down there looking for answers, though I'm not sure what kind. Boxes had been moved, not dramatically, just shifted enough to suggest someone had been searching. For what, among what? The flashlight beam caught something metallic behind the water heater. I a key I didn't recognize taped to the wall where no one would think to look. It opened a storage unit across town. Inside, more questions than answers, suitcases I'd never seen, documents with signatures that looked like hers but somehow weren't quite right, photographs of places we'd never been together, places I didn't recognize, and money. Not a fortune, but enough to start over somewhere else, enough to disappear. The man at the storage facility remembered her, said she'd been coming there for months, always alone, always nervous, paid in cash, never stayed long. He described someone who sounded like her but behaved like a stranger, careful, watchful, afraid. I started retracing her steps, or trying to. The grocery store she claimed to visit, the gym where she said she'd been taking classes, the friend she mentioned having lunch with. None of them had records of her. None of them knew her name. I was following the ghost of someone I thought I knew, discovering that the person I'd been living with might have been the ghost all along. The phone rang at night now. When I answered, silence. When I didn't, no message. Someone checking if I was home, if I was alone, if I was still looking. The calls came at different times from different numbers, but they carried the same weight, the same warning wrapped in electronic quiet. I changed the locks, installed cameras, started keeping a journal of everything I noticed, everything that felt wrong. The entries grew longer, more detailed, more paranoid. Reading them back, I couldn't tell if I was documenting real threats or manufacturing them from guilt and confusion. Because there was guilt about not noticing sooner, about not asking the right questions, about being so absorbed in my own routine that I missed the signs of someone planning to vanish from my life, or being forced to. The detective called with updates that weren't really updates. No leads, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play, but no evidence against it either. She'd simply stepped out of existence, leaving behind only the outline of a life that might have been performance rather than truth. I found myself studying that photograph again, her hand on my shoulder, but now I noticed my expression, distant, preoccupied, not really present in the moment she was trying to preserve. Maybe she knew even then that I wasn't paying attention. Maybe that's why she had to make other plans. The coffee cup is still on the counter. I haven't moved it, haven't touched it. It's become a shrine to my own blindness, evidence of a morning when everything seemed normal because I needed it to be. The crossword remains unfinished, 7 across still blank. Absence of sound. But silence isn't really the absence of sound. It's the presence of everything you weren't listening to before. And now, in the quiet of this house that feels too big and too empty, I hear everything. The settling walls, the humming refrigerator, the whisper of my own breathing. And sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps in the hallway, soft, familiar, moving toward the mirror that still doesn't reflect quite what it should. Equals. The door is 6. The ticking started again like a clock out of sight, but entirely too loud to be ignored. I was in the kitchen, wiping away crumbs, and froze as the sound cut through the silence. The clock above the stove was digital, yet the ticking persisted, precise and relentless. I strained to pinpoint its origin, feeling the smallness of the room closing in. Each tick drew me further from the present, somewhere dim and cluttered with echoes of a watch that hadn't been wound in years. I lingered, heartbeats syncing with the rhythm. It was a sound I hadn't heard since everything changed. The dish rag hung limp in my hand as I turned toward the living room, following the phantom rhythm. The carpet felt different under my bare feet, softer than I remembered, as though someone had replaced it while I wasn't paying attention. But that was impossible. I'd been here every day since the incident, hadn't I? The ticking grew louder near the bookshelf. I ran my fingers along the spines, searching for something that might house a mechanism. Philosophy texts, cookbooks, a few paperback mysteries with their corners bent from repeated reading. Nothing that could produce such a sound, yet it seemed to emanate from somewhere behind the books themselves, as if the wall had developed a heartbeat. I pulled out a volume about memory and consciousness, one I didn't remember purchasing. The pages fell open to a passage about how trauma can distort our perception of time, how seconds can stretch into eternities while entire days disappear without trace. Someone had underlined certain phrases in blue ink. The handwriting looked familiar, though I couldn't place it. The ticking stopped. In the sudden quiet, I became aware of my own breathing, shallow and irregular. The book trembled in my hands. I closed it and slid it back into place, but not before noticing a small piece of paper tucked between its pages. A receipt, faded and creased. The items listed were mundane household supplies, but the date troubled me. It suggested I'd made this purchase during a period I remembered spending entirely at home, paralyzed by grief and confusion. The detective had asked about my whereabouts during those weeks. I told him I barely left the house, that I could account for every hour spent staring at walls, waiting for answers that never came. But here was evidence of a trip I couldn't recall, proof that my memory had gaps I hadn't acknowledged. I moved to the window and pressed my palm against the glass. The neighborhood looked the same as always, rows of similar houses with their small front yards and predictable gardens. Yet something felt wrong about the scene, like a photograph that had been subtly altered. The house across the street, where the elderly woman lived with her collection of ceramic cats, seemed darker than usual. Its windows reflected nothing, not even the afternoon light. She had been the one to call the police that night. Her statement described sounds of an argument, raised voices carrying across the narrow space between our homes. But when I tried to remember arguing with anyone, I found only silence. The absence of memory felt heavier than any recollection could have been. The ticking resumed, fainter now, coming from a different direction entirely. I followed it toward the hallway, where family photographs lined the walls in mismatched frames. Most showed happier times, faces bright with the kind of joy that seems impossible to lose until it's gone. But one frame stood empty, its glass reflecting my own face back at me with uncomfortable clarity. I knew what photograph had once hung there. The image lived in my mind with perfect detail, every smile and gesture preserved in painful clarity. Yet I couldn't remember removing it, couldn't recall the decision to create this deliberate absence. The nail remained in the wall, and a faint rectangle of unfaded paint marked where the frame had protected the surface from light. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and studied my reflection. The person looking back seemed older than I felt, marked by experiences I couldn't quite access. There were lines around my eyes that suggested sleepless nights, a tightness in my expression that spoke of constant vigilance. When had I begun to look like someone who was always listening for approaching footsteps? The medicine cabinet mirror swung open at my touch, revealing the usual collection of everyday remedies. But behind a bottle of headache medication, I found something unexpected. A small recording device no larger than a matchbox. Its red light blinked steadily, indicating it was still active. The discovery sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the bathroom's cold tiles. I pressed the playback button with trembling fingers. My own voice emerged from the tiny speaker, distorted but unmistakable. I was speaking to someone, my tone urgent and pleading. The words were difficult to make out, but I caught fragments. You have to understand, and it wasn't supposed to happen this way, and most disturbing of all, I can't remember what I did. The recording ended abruptly, leaving only the soft hiss of empty tape. I stared at the device, trying to reconstruct the circumstances that had led me to hide it here. The effort felt like trying to grasp smoke. Every time I thought I'd captured a memory, it dissolved into uncertainty. Back in the kitchen, I opened drawers at random, searching for other evidence of actions I couldn't recall. The content seemed normal enough: utensils, dish towels, the accumulated debris of daily life. But in the drawer where I kept important papers, I found a business card for a locksmith. The card was creased and worn, as though it had been handled frequently. On the back, someone had written a phone number in the same blue ink I'd seen in the book. The ticking had become constant now, a steady rhythm that seemed to pulse through the walls themselves. I realized it matched the cadence of footsteps, the measured pace of someone walking back and forth in a confined space. But I was alone in the house. I had to be alone. The alternative was too disturbing to consider. I called the number on the card. A woman answered, her voice professionally neutral. When I gave my address, she paused before speaking again. Yes, she remembered the job. I had requested new locks for all the exterior doors, claiming I'd lost my keys. But according to her records, I'd also asked for something unusual: locks that could be operated from the inside without a key, but would require one to open from the outside. The conversation left me more confused than before. Why would I trap myself in my own home? What was I trying to keep out, or perhaps more troubling, what was I trying to keep in? The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I found myself avoiding those shadows, stepping carefully around them as if they might be solid obstacles. The ticking grew louder as darkness approached, until it seemed to fill every corner of the house. I returned to the bookshelf and pulled out more volumes, looking for additional clues. Behind a cookbook, I discovered a manila envelope containing photographs I didn't remember taking. They showed the interior of my own house, but from angles that suggested someone trying to document evidence. Each room was captured in stark detail, with certain objects circled in red marker. In one photograph, the empty picture frame was visible, but in this image it still contained its missing photograph. I could make out two figures in the frame, but their faces were obscured by the camera's flash. Still, something about their posture suggested intimacy, a closeness that implied more than casual acquaintance. The final photograph in the envelope showed the basement door, which I rarely opened. In the image, the door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. But someone had drawn an arrow pointing toward that darkness, and beneath it had written a single word: remember. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, my hand resting on the light switch. The ticking seemed to originate from below now, echoing up through the wooden steps. Each tick reverberated in my chest, a physical sensation that made breathing difficult. I descended slowly, the old stairs creaking under my weight. The basement smelled of damp concrete and something else, something organic and slightly sweet. The scent triggered a memory so vivid it made me stumble. The same smell had filled the house on the night everything changed. The night the police came and asked their careful questions about timelines and relationships, and whether I'd noticed anything unusual. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the source of the ticking. An old wind-up clock sat on a workbench, its face cracked, but its hands still moving with mechanical precision. I was certain it hadn't been there before, yet it looked as though it had occupied that spot for years. Dust had settled around its base, and a spider had built a web between its hands. Beside the clock lay a journal I didn't recognize, its pages filled with handwriting that might have been mine, but seemed somehow different, more urgent and less controlled than my usual script. The entries described a growing sense of being watched, of finding objects moved from their usual places, of conversations I couldn't quite remember having. One entry stood out: the ticking follows me everywhere now. I think it's trying to tell me something, trying to remind me of what I've forgotten. But every time I get close to understanding, the memory slips away like water through my fingers. Maybe forgetting is a kindness. Maybe some truths are too heavy to carry. The handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, until the final pages were nearly illegible. But I could make out enough to understand that whoever had written these words believed they were losing their grip on reality, that the boundary between memory and imagination had become dangerously thin. I climbed back up the stairs, the journal clutched against my chest. In the kitchen, I sat at the table and tried to make sense of what I'd discovered. The evidence suggested a version of myself I didn't recognize, someone capable of actions I couldn't remember and thoughts I couldn't access. The ticking had stopped again, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt oppressive. In that quiet, I heard something else, the soft sound of breathing that wasn't my own. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as though the house itself had developed lungs. I looked toward the living room window and saw a figure standing in the yard across the street. The elderly woman with the ceramic cats was watching my house, her face barely visible in the gathering darkness. When our eyes met through the glass, she didn't look away. Instead, she raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. The phone rang, startling me from my observation. The caller's voice was familiar but strained, as though filtered through layers of static and distance. They asked if I was all right, if I'd been taking my medication, if I remembered what we discussed about the importance of maintaining my routine. I couldn't place the voice, couldn't remember any previous conversations about medication or routines. But something in the caller's tone suggested they knew me well, perhaps better than I knew myself. When I asked who they were, the line went quiet for a long moment before they spoke again. "You asked me to call and check on you. You said you might forget, but that I should keep trying to help you remember." The call ended before I could ask more questions. I stared at the phone, wondering how many other conversations I'd forgotten, how many relationships I'd lost to whatever was happening to my memory. Night had fallen completely now, transforming the familiar rooms into a landscape of shadows and uncertain shapes. I moved through the house like a stranger, noticing details that seemed both foreign and intimately known. The way light fell across the hardwood floor created patterns I didn't remember seeing before, yet they felt as familiar as my own reflection. In the bedroom, I found more evidence of a life I couldn't recall living. Clothes in the closet that weren't quite my style, books on the nightstand that I had no memory of reading, prescription bottles with my name, but for conditions I didn't remember having. Each discovery felt like meeting a version of myself that had been living parallel to my conscious existence. The ticking started again as I prepared for sleep, softer now but still insistent. It seemed to be counting down toward something, marking the passage of time until an event I couldn't anticipate. I lay in bed listening to its rhythm, feeling my heartbeat gradually synchronize with its mechanical pulse. In the darkness, fragments of memory began to surface like objects floating up from deep water. I remembered voices raised in anger, the sound of something breaking, the weight of a decision that couldn't be undone. But the details remained elusive, slipping away whenever I tried to examine them too closely. The ticking continued through the night, a constant reminder that time was passing whether I was aware of it or not. By morning, I understood that I might never recover the memories I'd lost, might never know for certain what had happened during those missing hours. But I also realized that forgetting might have been a choice, a way of protecting myself from truths too painful to bear. The clock in the basement would keep ticking, marking time that felt both lost and preserved. and I would continue to live in the spaces between memory and forgetting, never quite certain which version of events was real, never quite sure whether I was the victim of my circumstances or their architect. The sound had become part of me now, a rhythm that would follow me wherever I went, reminding me that some questions are more important than their answers, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Equals. Story 7. The clocks were set to 7:15 a.m. at the time of inspection. Surveillance footage corroborates a lack of movement from the point of entry through to the kitchen area. Chairs remained aligned with the table untouched, and the cupboard doors were found closed with all contents intact. A single plate rested in the sink, alongside a knife still thinly smeared with butter. The refrigerator displayed a constant temperature, with the door's seal unbroken. Curtains were drawn, although sunlight was visible through a small crack in the fabric. No audible alarms or alerts were detected during the 3-hour window. A coat was missing from the rack, but its pockets were empty and undisturbed. The butter, that's what I keep coming back to. Yellow, soft at the edges where the knife had scraped across. Such a small thing, but it sits in my mind like a weight. I can see it even now, that thin film clinging to the blade. I was there that morning, I know I was, but the sequence of events, the order of things, it all feels scrambled, like trying to put together a puzzle when half the pieces have fallen under the table. The coat rack stood empty except for that one missing piece. I remember staring at it, feeling something wrong but unable to name what. The hooks curved like question marks against the wall. There should have been something there, shouldn't there? Something familiar. But I'm getting ahead of myself, or behind myself. Time doesn't seem to work the way it should when I try to remember. The kitchen felt cold despite the undisturbed temperature readings. I can still feel the linoleum under my feet, that slight give with each step. The chairs were perfect, too perfect. Pushed in at exact angles like someone had measured the distance. Who does that? Who leaves a kitchen looking like a showroom? Everything appears normal, someone said. Was it me? Was I talking to myself, or was there someone else there? The voice echoes strangely in my memory, hollow and distant. The plate in the sink bothered me more than it should have. One plate, one knife. One person's breakfast, interrupted or completed, I couldn't tell which. The butter had that fresh look, not quite hardened, as if the knife had been set down recently. But recently when? I walked through the house, or I think I did. The floorboards creaked in places, silent in others. Each room held its breath, waiting for something I couldn't identify. The curtains were drawn tight except for that single crack, a sliver of light cutting across the carpet like a scar. The surveillance footage showed nothing. Empty hallways, static rooms, no movement at all. But I was there, wasn't I? How could I be there and not be there at the same time? My hands were shaking, I remember that clearly now. Standing in the kitchen, staring at that knife, and my hands wouldn't stay still. The butter caught the light from the crack in the curtains, gleaming like something precious or dangerous. Did you check the basement? The voice again, clearer this time. Definitely not mine, but when I turn around in my memory, there's no one there, just empty space and the sound of my own breathing. The missing coat haunts me, not because it was gone, but because I could almost remember it hanging there. Dark fabric, maybe wool, heavy enough to matter. The pockets were empty, they said, but what had been in them before? What gets removed from pockets before a coat disappears? I keep trying to remember what I was doing there. Was I investigating? Was I supposed to be there? The official report treats me like a witness, but I feel more like a suspect. Of what, I don't know. The refrigerator hummed its constant song, undisturbed and normal, but I remember opening it or wanting to open it, looking for something that should have been there but wasn't. Milk, maybe, or leftovers from a dinner that never happened. The 3-hour window, that's what they called it. 3 hours when nothing happened, when no one moved through those rooms, when the house simply existed in perfect, terrible stillness. But I have memories from those hours. Fragments of walking, of searching, of finding things that weren't supposed to be there. Or maybe finding nothing where something should have been. The butter knife lies at the center of it all. I can see my reflection in the blade, distorted and strange. Was I holding it? Did I pick it up from the sink? The memory shifts every time I try to focus on it. Check the upstairs windows, someone suggested. The same voice, patient and persistent, but the upstairs felt wrong, like a place I shouldn't go. The stairs creaked under weight that might have been mine. The surveillance cameras saw nothing because they were looking in the wrong places, or maybe they were looking at the wrong things. Movement isn't the only sign that something has happened. Sometimes the absence of movement is more telling. I think I knew who lived there. The knowledge sits just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue. Someone familiar, someone whose morning routine I might have known. Coffee first or tea. Toast with butter, obviously. One plate, one knife, one person's careful ritual. But where were they? The coat rack keeps calling me back. 5 hooks, 4 empty, one missing its burden. The wood was polished, well maintained. Someone cared about that coat rack, took pride in it. The kind of person who would push chairs in at perfect angles and keep their cupboards organized. The kind of person who wouldn't just disappear. But people do disappear, don't they? Sometimes they disappear while you're looking right at them. I remember touching the wall near the coat rack, feeling for something. A switch, maybe, or a hidden panel. The wallpaper was slightly faded where the missing coat would have hung, a shadow of habitual presence. The timeline doesn't match, I said or thought or heard someone else say. What timeline? The 3 hours of stillness or something longer? Something that stretched back beyond that morning, beyond the butter-smeared knife and the perfect chairs. The crack in the curtains let in just enough light to make everything else seem darker. I could have opened them wider, could have flooded the room with clarity, but I didn't. Some part of me needed the shadows, needed the uncertainty. The butter was getting softer as I watched, or as I remembered watching, spreading slightly on the blade, losing its shape. How long does butter take to soften? How long had I been standing there? My reflection in the kitchen window showed someone I almost recognized, familiar features arranged in an unfamiliar expression. When had I started looking so worried, so guilty? The basement door was closed, I'm sure of that, but I have a memory of it being open, of stairs descending into darkness. Which memory is real? Can they both be real? You need to remember, the voice insisted, gentle but urgent. You need to remember what happened before. Before what? Before the butter, before the missing coat, before the 3 hours of perfect stillness. Or before I arrived, before I became part of whatever story was unfolding in that too quiet house. The refrigerator's hum grew louder, or maybe everything else grew quieter. Inside would be the usual things, milk, eggs, leftovers in careful containers, evidence of a life lived in routine, in small daily choices. But whose life? I think I opened the cupboards, though the report says they were found closed. Inside, dishes arranged with the same precision as the chairs. Everything in its place, everything exactly where it should be, except for the one plate in the sink, the one knife with its burden of butter. The missing coat had pockets. Empty pockets, they said, but pockets remember what they've held. Keys, maybe. Or a phone that might have answered questions I didn't know how to ask. The surveillance footage looped endlessly in my mind. Empty rooms, static furniture, no movement at all. But I was there. I remember being there. How do you reconcile presence with absence, memory with evidence? The butter on the knife was my butter. I know that now, though I'm not sure how I know it. My breakfast, my routine, my careful morning ritual interrupted by something I can't quite recall. The coat was my coat. The house was my house. But if that's true, then who was I investigating? Who was I looking for in rooms that should have been familiar? And why do I remember it all like a stranger's story, like something that happened to someone else? The crack in the curtains shows the same sliver of light cutting across the same patch of carpet. I'm back where I started, staring at the same butter-smeared knife, feeling the same wrongness that I can't name. The 3 hours of stillness weren't empty. They were full of something I've forgotten, something I needed to forget. But the butter remembers, soft and yellow and clinging to the blade like evidence of a life that might have been mine. Or might have been someone else's entirely. The voice that asked about the basement, about the windows, about checking the timeline, it's clearer now. It sounds like me, but not quite, like an echo of myself, or a version of myself that knew things I've chosen not to know. The butter gleams in the light from the crack in the curtains, and I remember now why I keep coming back to it. It's not just evidence of breakfast interrupted. It's evidence of forgetting. And forgetting, sometimes, is the only way to survive what we've done. Equals. Story 8. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of curtains in the breeze, a movement I hadn't noticed before. Shadows played tricks on the walls, bending and stretching beyond their natural reach. Everything in the room was still: the furniture, the air, even the clock whose ticking seemed to have paused. The tension lay in the quiet stir of the outside world, creeping in through the narrow slits of the window blinds. I could feel a presence not seen but suggested by the unnatural motion of light and shadow. The air grew heavier, and for a moment it felt as if the room exhaled, whispering secrets I wasn't meant to decipher. A hint of unfamiliar cologne drifted in, a reminder that I was not alone with my silence. But I knew what had happened here. I had always known. My brother had been murdered in this room. The facts were simple, clean, undeniable. He had been sitting at his desk, working late as he always did, when someone entered through the window. A robbery gone wrong. The police had explained it all to me with patient voices and careful words. The window latch was broken from the outside. His wallet was missing. There were signs of a struggle: the overturned chair, the scattered papers, the lamp knocked to the floor. I had accepted their version because it made sense. It gave shape to the shapeless horror of loss. It provided an answer to the question that had been eating at me since I found him there, slumped over his desk, still warm to the touch. The intruder had panicked when my brother fought back. These things happened in neighborhoods like ours, where old houses sat too close to busy streets and windows were left unlocked out of habit rather than wisdom. The investigation had been thorough but brief. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA evidence that led anywhere meaningful. The case grew cold within months, filed away in some drawer downtown, but I didn't need the police to catch whoever did it. I had my certainty. I had my story. I had my grief properly organized and labeled. For months, I told people exactly what had happened. I could recite the sequence of events like a prayer I had memorized. The break-in occurred sometime after midnight. My brother had been working on his monthly reports. I found them scattered across the floor, some pages torn. The intruder had climbed through the window facing the alley, probably expecting the house to be empty. When they encountered my brother, things went wrong quickly. I even knew why I had found him the next morning. We had planned to meet for breakfast, something we did every few weeks to catch up on family business. When he didn't answer his phone, I used my spare key. I called his name as I walked through the house, expecting to find him asleep, maybe having worked too late to hear his alarm. Instead, I found the scene that would replay in my mind every night for months afterward. The story held together perfectly. Every detail supported every other detail. The broken window latch, the missing wallet, the scattered papers, the overturned furniture. Even the fact that nothing else in the house had been disturbed. The intruder had fled immediately after the confrontation, too panicked to search for anything else of value. I had told this story so many times that it felt more real than my actual memories of that morning. I could describe the break-in with more clarity than I could remember my brother's voice. The narrative had become a kind of armor, protecting me from the jagged edges of uncertainty. But then I started noticing things that didn't fit. It began with the cologne. That first night when I returned to clean out his house, I caught that scent again, the same unfamiliar fragrance that had puzzled me the morning I found him. At the time, I had assumed it belonged to the intruder, some lingering trace of their presence. But now, standing in the same spot, breathing the same air, I realized something that made my chest tighten with unease. The cologne wasn't fading. If anything, it seemed stronger. I walked through the house room by room, following the scent like a trail. It led me back to his bedroom, to his closet, to a shelf I had never paid attention to before. There, behind his winter coats, I found a bottle I didn't recognize. The cologne was his. He had been wearing it that night. This single discovery shouldn't have mattered. People buy new cologne all the time. People change their habits, their preferences, their routines. But my brother had used the same aftershave for as long as I could remember. He was a creature of habit in almost everything: his morning coffee, his evening walks, his weekend phone calls to our mother. The idea that he would suddenly switch to an expensive cologne, one that he had hidden behind his winter clothes, felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I sat on his bed holding the bottle, trying to understand why this small thing felt so significant. The cologne was nearly empty, which meant he had been using it regularly. But I had never smelled it on him before that morning. How was that possible when we saw each other every few weeks? The question opened a crack in my certainty, and through that crack, other doubts began to seep in. I started thinking about the window. The police had said the latch was broken from the outside, clear evidence of forced entry. But when I really examined it, crouching down to look at the metal mechanism the way I should have months ago, I noticed something strange. The break was clean, almost surgical. The metal hadn't been bent or twisted the way it would be if someone had pried it open with a crowbar or screwdriver. It looked more like it had been carefully removed and then replaced incorrectly. My brother was handy with tools. He fixed things around the house constantly, always tinkering with something that didn't quite work right. I had seen him remove and reinstall that same window latch when he painted the frame the previous summer. He knew exactly how it came apart. Standing there in the growing dusk, staring at that latch, I felt the first real tremor of doubt about everything I thought I knew. What if the window hadn't been broken by an intruder trying to get in? What if it had been staged to look that way? But staged by whom and why? The questions multiplied like cracks in ice, spreading outward from that single point of doubt until everything I had accepted as fact began to feel unstable. I found myself returning to the house night after night, walking through the rooms, touching the furniture, trying to read the story written in the arrangement of objects. The overturned chair bothered me now. It was a heavy wooden chair, the kind that didn't tip over easily. I tried to recreate the struggle I had imagined, pushing and pulling the chair the way it might have been moved during a confrontation. But every time I knocked it over, it fell in a different direction than where I had found it. To land where it had been that morning, it would have had to be lifted and placed there deliberately. The scattered papers told a different story too, now that I was looking at them with suspicious eyes. I had assumed they had been swept off the desk during the struggle, but when I examined them more carefully, I realized they weren't random. They were all financial documents, bank statements, investment reports, insurance papers. The kind of documents someone might pull out if they were looking for specific information, not the kind that would be scattered by accident during a fight. I spent hours going through those papers, looking for some clue about what someone might have been searching for. My brother's finances were complicated but not unusual. He had savings accounts, a retirement fund, some modest investments, nothing that would attract the attention of criminals, nothing worth killing for. But there was one thing that caught my attention. His life insurance policy had been updated recently. The beneficiary was still me, as it had always been, but the payout amount had been increased significantly. The change had been made just weeks before his death. I stared at that document for a long time, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Why would my brother suddenly increase his life insurance? He was healthy, relatively young, not the type to worry about mortality, unless he had reason to believe he might need it. Or unless someone had convinced him he needed it. The thought arrived unbidden, unwelcome, but impossible to dismiss once it had formed. I tried to push it away, to return to my comfortable certainty about the break-in and the robbery gone wrong. But the doubt had taken root now, and it grew stronger every time I returned to the house. I began to notice other things that didn't fit the story I had been telling myself. The fact that my brother's computer was still logged in when I found him, as if he had been expecting to return to his work. The fact that his coffee cup was still warm, suggesting he had made it shortly before he died. The fact that there were 2 glasses in the sink, both recently used. 2 glasses, I had seen them that morning but hadn't registered their significance. My brother lived alone. He rarely had visitors, especially not late at night, but someone had been there with him, someone who had shared a drink before things went wrong. I tried to remember if the police had mentioned the glasses, if they had tested them for fingerprints or DNA, but my memories of those first few days were hazy, filtered through shock and grief. I had been so focused on accepting their explanation that I hadn't asked the right questions. Now I was asking too many questions, and none of them had comfortable answers. I started going through my brother's phone records, his emails, his calendar. I was looking for evidence of who might have been with him that night, but what I found was more disturbing than any single visitor. In the weeks before his death, my brother had been in contact with people I didn't recognize. Phone calls to numbers I couldn't identify. Meetings marked in his calendar with initials instead of names. He had been living a life I knew nothing about. The realization hit me like cold water. I had thought I knew my brother well. We talked regularly, saw each other often, shared the casual intimacy of family. But the evidence in front of me suggested he had been keeping secrets, maintaining relationships I knew nothing about, engaging in activities he had never mentioned. Who was the person who had shared that drink with him on his last night? What had they talked about? What had gone wrong between them? I found myself studying the scene of his death with new eyes, trying to read the story written in the position of his body, the arrangement of the furniture, the pattern of the scattered papers. He had been sitting at his desk when he died, but facing away from his computer toward the door. as if he had been talking to someone, as if he had turned to look at his visitor just before it happened. The medical examiner had said he died quickly, quietly. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. Whatever had happened, he hadn't seen it coming. He had trusted whoever was with him right up until the end. That trust felt like another clue, another piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. My brother was cautious by nature, not the type to let strangers into his house late at night. Whoever had been with him was someone he knew, someone he felt comfortable with, someone he had no reason to fear. Someone like me. The thought appeared in my mind like a whisper, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. But once it was there, I couldn't make it go away. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, as the kind of twisted thinking that comes from spending too much time alone with unanswered questions. But the doubt had its hooks in me now, and it wouldn't let go. I started examining my own memories of that night, looking for gaps, for inconsistencies, for signs that I might be forgetting something important. But my memories felt solid, unchanging. I had been at home, alone, watching television until late. I had gone to bed around midnight, slept soundly, woken early to get ready for our breakfast meeting. Except now I wasn't entirely sure about the sleeping soundly part. I had been having trouble sleeping in the weeks before my brother's death. Stress at work, problems with my relationship, the general anxiety that seemed to follow me everywhere. I had been taking pills to help me sleep, prescription medication that sometimes left me groggy and disoriented in the morning. Had I really been home that night? The question felt absurd, impossible, but it lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I tried to remember specific details, what I had watched on television, what I had eaten for dinner, whether I had talked to anyone on the phone. But the memories felt vague, generic, like they could have belonged to any night. I found myself checking my phone records, looking for evidence of where I had been and what I had been doing. But there were no calls that night, no text messages, no digital breadcrumbs to prove my whereabouts. I had been alone with my insomnia and my sleeping pills, alone with thoughts I could no longer clearly remember. The insurance money had already been processed, a check for a substantial amount made out to me as the sole beneficiary. I had deposited it without thinking much about it, treating it as just another piece of bureaucracy to handle in the aftermath of loss. But now the money felt heavy in my account, weighted with implications I didn't want to consider. I started avoiding the house, afraid of what else I might discover there. But the questions followed me home, invaded my sleep, colored every interaction with doubt. When people asked me how I was doing, I found myself studying their faces, looking for signs that they suspected something. When they offered condolences, I wondered if they were really offering alibis. The police had never seriously considered me as a suspect. Why would they? I was the grieving brother, the one who found the body, the one who cooperated fully with their investigation. I had no apparent motive, no history of violence, no reason to want my brother dead. The break-in theory had satisfied them completely. But I was starting to understand that the break-in theory satisfied me too. Maybe too completely, maybe too conveniently. I tried to reconstruct that morning again, the morning I found him. I remembered using my spare key, calling his name, walking through the house with growing concern. But when I really focused on those memories, they felt strangely distant, like I was remembering a movie I had seen rather than something I had experienced. Had I really called his name? Had I really expected him to answer? Or had I known, even before I opened the door, exactly what I would find inside? The cologne bottle sat on my kitchen table now, where I had placed it after bringing it home from his house. I found myself staring at it during meals, wondering why he had hidden it, wondering when he had started wearing it, wondering if I had smelled it on him that morning because he had been wearing it when he died, or because I had been wearing it when I found him. The thought made my hands shake. I pushed it away, but it kept returning, each time a little stronger, a little more insistent. I tried to remember if I owned cologne, if I had ever worn any fragrance that might have lingered in his house, but I couldn't remember. The sleeping pills had made so many of my memories fuzzy, uncertain, unreliable. I called the medical examiner's office, claiming I needed closure, asking for details about the autopsy that I hadn't wanted to hear before. The person I spoke with was patient but cautious, unwilling to share information that might be too disturbing for a grieving family member, but I pressed and eventually learned something that made my blood feel cold. There had been no signs of forced entry on my brother's body. No cuts, no bruises, no indication that he had been attacked by a stranger. He had simply stopped breathing, quietly and without struggle, as if he had fallen asleep and never woken up. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, possibly brought on by stress or an underlying condition that had never been diagnosed. Natural causes, in other words, with no evidence of foul play. The break-in scenario had been constructed around the scene, not around the body. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the cologne bottle, trying to understand what I had learned. If my brother had died of natural causes, then there had been no intruder, no robbery, no murder at all. Just a man who had died suddenly and unexpectedly, and a scene that had been arranged afterward to look like something else. But arranged by whom and why? The answers felt close now, hovering just at the edge of my consciousness like shapes moving in fog. I could almost see them, almost grasp them, but every time I reached for certainty, it slipped away, leaving me with nothing but questions and the growing suspicion that I already knew more than I was allowing myself to remember. The room where my brother died felt different now when I visited it. The shadows seemed less random, the silence less empty. It felt like a stage where a performance had taken place, where someone had carefully arranged props and lighting to tell a specific story. But I was no longer sure who the audience had been or whether the performance was over. I stood in the doorway, breathing the air that still carried traces of that cologne, listening to the soft rustle of curtains in the breeze, watching shadows play tricks on the walls. Everything in the room was still, but the stillness felt expectant now, as if the room was waiting for me to remember something, to understand something, to finally see what had been hidden in plain sight all along. The presence I felt wasn't the lingering trace of an intruder. It was something else, something closer, something that had been with me since the beginning, but that I had been too afraid or too medicated or too guilty to acknowledge. I closed my eyes and tried to let the memory come, whatever it was, however terrible it might be. But all I found was darkness and the sound of my own breathing and the faint, persistent scent of cologne that might have been his, or might have been mine, or might have belonged to someone else entirely. The truth was there, waiting in that darkness, but I wasn't sure I was ready to find it, or what I would do if I did. Equals. Story 9. The Sound of Silence. For as long as I can remember, every evening at 7, the sound of a key turning twice in the lock next door was my cue to start dinner. The metal clink, the faint shuffle of footsteps, everything choreographed with mundane precision. It was the sort of pattern you barely notice background music in the script of daily life. But last Monday, the lock turned only once. Tuesday, I heard no footsteps follow. By Thursday, the silence was more than just an absence of noise. It hung there, waiting on the other side of the wall. And now, the door remains locked, even when it shouldn't be. I never considered myself the type to pry into other people's business. My own life provided enough complications without borrowing someone else's troubles, but the absence of that familiar routine created a void that seemed to expand with each passing evening. The woman next door had lived there for 3 years, and in all that time our interactions never extended beyond polite nods in the hallway and the occasional shared complaint about the building's temperamental heating system. She was the kind of person who moved through life quietly, almost apologetically. Medium height, brown hair usually pulled back in a ponytail, clothes that suggested someone who preferred to blend into crowds rather than stand out from them. I learned her profession from the mailman during one of his chattier moments. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm downtown. The kind of job that requires attention to detail and a methodical approach to life. Perhaps that explained the precision of her daily routine. The first time I knocked on her door, I told myself I was being neighborly. The sound echoed strangely in the hallway, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. No answer. I pressed my ear against the cool wood and heard nothing, not the hum of a television, not the creak of floorboards, not even the subtle sounds of someone trying to remain quiet, just an emptiness that felt deliberate. I waited 2 more days before approaching the building superintendent. He was a gruff man with permanently stained fingers who seemed to view tenant concerns as personal affronts to his authority. When I mentioned not seeing my neighbor recently, he shrugged and muttered something about people going out of town without notice. But his eyes shifted away from mine when he said it, and his hands fumbled with his keys longer than necessary. That night I found myself standing in my kitchen with the lights off, listening. The building had its own language of sounds, pipes settling, floors expanding, the distant murmur of lives being lived behind closed doors, but from the apartment next door, nothing. I realized I had been unconsciously waiting for that double click of the lock, the signal that someone was home, that the natural order of things remained intact. The next morning I noticed something I had missed before. Her mailbox was overflowing. Letters and advertisements spilled out in a cascade of white and colored paper, creating a small pile on the floor beneath. The sight made my stomach tighten with an uneasiness I couldn't quite name. People who maintain strict routines don't simply abandon them without reason. I began paying attention to details I had previously ignored. The window of her apartment faced the courtyard, and I could see it from my living room if I positioned myself correctly. The blinds remained drawn, but there was something about the way they hung that suggested no one had adjusted them recently. A thin layer of dust had begun to accumulate on the exterior sill, and a single dead plant sat in a pot near the glass, its brown leaves pressed against the window like a desperate hand. The building manager's office occupied a cramped space in the basement, filled with the smell of old cigarettes and industrial cleaning supplies. When I mentioned the overflowing mailbox, he seemed more annoyed than concerned. He explained that tenants were responsible for their own mail and that he wasn't required to check on residents unless there was a specific complaint about noise or property damage. But something in his manner suggested he knew more than he was sharing. His responses came too quickly, as if rehearsed, and he kept glancing at a particular filing cabinet while we spoke. When I asked if he had a forwarding address or emergency contact information, he claimed tenant privacy prevented him from sharing such details. The conversation ended abruptly when his phone rang, and he answered it with obvious relief. Walking back through the lobby, I encountered another neighbor, an elderly woman who lived on the 3rd floor. She had the kind of observant eyes that missed nothing and the social confidence of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of neighborhood surveillance. When I casually mentioned not seeing the woman from the apartment next to mine, her expression shifted subtly. She invited me for coffee, and within minutes I found myself sitting in her meticulously organized living room, surrounded by photographs and the lingering scent of lavender. She spoke in the careful way people use when they want to share information without appearing to gossip. According to her observations, my neighbor had been receiving visitors recently unusual for someone who typically kept to herself. The visitors came at odd hours, she explained, and they didn't seem like the type of people who would normally associate with a quiet bookkeeper. Men in expensive cars who stayed only briefly but left with obvious tension in their movements. She had noticed because their voices carried in the hallway, though she couldn't make out specific words. This information created more questions than answers. I tried to reconcile the image of my methodical, routine-oriented neighbor with someone who entertained mysterious visitors. The contradiction felt like a puzzle piece that belonged to a different picture entirely. That evening I found myself once again standing in my darkened kitchen, but this time I was listening for something different. Instead of waiting for familiar sounds, I was trying to detect any sign of life, any indication that someone might be inside that apartment, unable or unwilling to make noise. The silence felt heavier now, loaded with possibilities I didn't want to consider. I decided to contact her workplace. The accounting firm was listed in the phone directory, and when I called, I explained that I was a neighbor concerned about her well-being. The receptionist put me on hold for several minutes before returning with information that made my hands tremble slightly. My neighbor had not reported to work for over a week and had not called in sick or requested time off. They had been trying to reach her themselves. The conversation left me staring at my phone long after the line went dead. A person doesn't simply vanish from their established life without leaving traces, without someone noticing the disruption. But the more I investigated, the more it seemed like the people who should have been concerned were actively avoiding the subject. I began documenting what I knew, writing down times, dates, and observations in a small notebook I kept by my kitchen window. The act of recording details made the situation feel more real and simultaneously more surreal. I was creating evidence of an absence, proof of something that might be nothing at all. The building superintendent appeared at my door 3 days later, his usual gruffness replaced by something that resembled nervousness. He claimed to have received complaints about me asking questions about other tenants and suggested I mind my own business. But his warning felt hollow, delivered without conviction, as if he were reciting lines someone else had written for him. After he left, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The hallway smelled different, not bad exactly, but wrong somehow. It was a sweet, cloying scent that seemed to emanate from the general direction of my neighbor's door. I had encountered that smell before, but I couldn't immediately place where or when. That night I dreamed about keys turning in locks, but in the dream, the sound was wet and organic, like bones breaking. I woke with the certainty that something terrible had happened, though I had no concrete evidence to support the feeling. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the police. The officer who responded was younger than I expected, with tired eyes that suggested he had seen enough human tragedy to last several lifetimes. He listened to my concerns with professional patience, taking notes in a small pad while I explained about the routine, the silence, the overflowing mail, the mysterious visitors. When I finished, he asked questions that revealed the limitations of my knowledge. What was my neighbor's full name? Did I have any proof she was actually missing rather than simply away? Had I witnessed any actual crime or evidence of foul play? My answers highlighted how little I truly knew about the person whose absence had consumed my thoughts. But something in my account must have resonated with him because he agreed to perform a welfare check. We walked together to her door, and he knocked with the authority of someone accustomed to demanding answers. The sound echoed through the hallway, but the silence that followed felt different now, not empty, but full of secrets. The officer tried the door handle and found it locked. He asked if I had noticed any unusual smells, and when I mentioned the sweet scent from the day before, his expression became more serious. He made a phone call, speaking in codes and abbreviations that meant nothing to me, but seemed to convey the gravity of the situation to whoever was listening. Within an hour, more people arrived. Detectives, technicians, someone from the building management company with keys. I watched from my doorway as they entered the apartment, and I saw their faces change when they encountered whatever was waiting inside. They asked me to step back to give them space to work, but I could see enough to understand that my neighbor would not be returning to her routine. The sweet smell I had noticed was stronger now, unmistakable in its implications. The next several hours passed in a blur of questions, statements, and official procedures. I found myself sitting in my living room with a detective who wanted to know everything I had observed, every detail I had documented in my notebook. She was thorough and patient, but I could sense her frustration with how little concrete information I could provide. What emerged from the investigation challenged everything I thought I knew about my quiet neighbor. The mysterious visitors were connected to financial irregularities at her workplace money that had been moved through accounts in ways that suggested knowledge and complicity rather than victimization. The routine I had found so comforting was apparently a facade covering activities that were anything but mundane. But the more the investigators revealed, the less sense it made. The evidence suggested involvement in something criminal, but the woman I had observed seemed incapable of the kind of deception such activities would require. The contradiction haunted me as I tried to reconcile the two versions of the same person. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined, though the circumstances suggested foul play. No arrests were made. The case file grew thick with interviews, forensic reports, and financial records, but no clear narrative emerged to explain what had happened or why. Months later, I still find myself listening for the sound of keys in locks, for footsteps in hallways, for the familiar rhythms that make life feel predictable and safe. But I have learned that the people we think we know are often strangers wearing masks of familiarity, and that the routines we depend on can disappear without warning, leaving only questions that may never find answers. The apartment next door remains empty. Sometimes I hear sounds from within the building settling, pipes adjusting to temperature changes, the natural noises of an unoccupied space. But occasionally, late at night, I think I hear something else. The soft shuffle of footsteps, the gentle click of a lock being turned. I tell myself it's imagination, the mind's attempt to restore order to a world that revealed itself to be far more chaotic than I had believed. But part of me wonders if some routines are so deeply ingrained that they continue even after the person who created them is gone, echoing through empty rooms like a ghost of normalcy in a place where nothing was ever quite what it seemed. Equals. Story 10. The weight of silence. I told them I hadn't touched anything. The words slipped out easily as I pointed vaguely down the hall. The daylight barely crept past the threshold, casting long, silent shadows that whispered across the tiles. The air was sharp, carrying a metallic tang that lingered on the back of my tongue. I felt the weight of the room pressing against my skin, a heaviness that didn't belong. The clock ticked, but it was the only sound the kind that makes silence feel louder. I didn't mention the warmth that still radiated from the coffee cup or the whisper of a fan somewhere behind closed doors, but the scent of her perfume clung to my sleeves. Standing there watching the investigators move through her apartment like ghosts disturbing dust, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Not just because she was gone, but because of how wrong everything felt. The coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, lipstick still marking its rim in a perfect crescent moon. Steam had long since stopped rising from its surface, but when I'd arrived that morning, it had been warm. Warm enough to suggest she'd been there moments before I found her bedroom door standing open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. I'd known her for 3 years. We worked in the same building, shared the same elevator most mornings, exchanged pleasantries about weather and weekend plans. She had a habit of humming under her breath old songs from decades past that somehow sounded hauntingly beautiful in her voice. I'd never asked her name for those songs, and now I never would. The detective assigned to her case had kind eyes, but hands that never stopped moving. He wrote in a small notebook with pages so worn the spiral binding had begun to separate. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of too many similar conversations. "You said you came here to check on her." I nodded, my throat feeling suddenly dry. She missed work yesterday. That wasn't like her. She was the type who came in even when she was sick, always worried about letting people down. The detective's pen scratched against paper, and you had a key. She gave it to me last month when she went out of town, said she felt better knowing someone could check on her plants. I gestured toward the windowsill where 3 small succulents sat in ceramic pots, their leaves thick and green with careful tending. I guess I never gave it back. What I didn't tell him was that she'd pressed that key into my palm with an urgency that had surprised me. Her fingers had been cold, trembling slightly, and she'd held my hand a moment longer than necessary. "Just in case," she'd whispered, her eyes darting toward the hallway behind her. "You never know when someone might need help." I'd laughed it off then, assuming she was being overly cautious about her plants. But standing in her apartment now, surrounded by the careful arrangement of her life, I wondered if she'd known something I hadn't understood. The investigators worked methodically, photographing everything, bagging items that seemed ordinary but apparently held significance I couldn't grasp. A hairbrush, a torn piece of paper from beside her phone, a single earring found on the bathroom floor, its mate nowhere to be seen. I found myself studying the details they overlooked, the way her books were arranged on the shelf not alphabetically, but by height, creating a neat ascending line that spoke to someone who valued order. The refrigerator covered in takeout menus, but no photos, no personal touches that might reveal family or close friends. A calendar on the wall with neat handwriting marking appointments and obligations, but no social events, no birthdays, no reminders of joy. The detective approached me again, his notebook closed now. "We'll need you to come in and give a formal statement, but for now, can you think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her? Boyfriend, ex-husband, anyone she might have mentioned feeling threatened by?" I shook my head slowly, but even as I did, something nagged at the edges of my memory. Conversations in the elevator that had grown shorter over the past few weeks. The way she'd started looking over her shoulder when she walked to her car. How she'd begun asking me about my schedule, seemingly casual questions about when I arrived at work and when I left. She seemed nervous lately, I admitted, but she never said why. The detective made another note, nervous howl. Jumpy, like she was expecting something bad to happen. I paused, trying to capture the feeling that had been building between us. She started walking faster in the parking lot, and she'd check her rearview mirror constantly when she drove. I noticed because I sometimes ended up behind her leaving work. What I kept to myself was the conversation we'd had just days before. She'd cornered me by the coffee machine, her voice low and urgent. "If something happens to me," she'd said, "look in the box under my bed, the blue one with the ribbon, promise me." I'd tried to laugh it off, told her nothing was going to happen, but she'd grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me," she'd repeated, and I'd nodded just to ease the wild look in her eyes. Now, as the investigators finished their work and began filing out, I wondered about that blue box. They'd searched the bedroom thoroughly, but had they looked under the bed? The space had been dark, filled with storage containers and forgotten items. A blue box could easily be overlooked among the shadows. The detective handed me his card and reminded me about the statement. As the door closed behind the last investigator, I stood alone in the hallway, her key still warm in my palm. The building felt different now, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Every sound seemed amplified: the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of television from neighboring apartments, the soft whoosh of the elevator traveling between floors. I couldn't stop thinking about her promise to me and mine to her. That night I lay in my own bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past month. She'd been trying to tell me something, I realized now. The way she'd lingered after our conversations, as if waiting for me to ask the right question. The way she'd mentioned her weekend plans with unusual detail, as if creating an alibi. The way she'd started saying goodbye with a finality that should have alarmed me. I'd failed her while she was alive. I wouldn't fail her now. The next morning I called in sick to work and returned to her building. The police tape was gone, but the apartment remained sealed. I didn't need to get inside, though. I needed to talk to her neighbors, to piece together the picture of her final days that I'd been too blind to see while it was happening. The woman across the hall answered her door with suspicious eyes and arms crossed defensively. She was older, with gray hair pulled back severely, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd spent years observing other people's business. "You're the one who found her," she said before I could introduce myself. I nodded. I was wondering if you noticed anything unusual lately, any strange visitors or sounds from her apartment. The woman's expression softened slightly. She was a quiet girl, kept to herself mostly, but these past few weeks, she glanced down the hallway as if checking for eavesdroppers. There were phone calls late at night. I could hear her voice through the walls, upset, arguing with someone. Could you make out what she was saying? Not the words, but the tone. She was scared and angry, like someone was threatening her. The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. And there was a man. I saw him in the parking lot a few times, just sitting in his car, watching the building. Dark hair, average height. He never came inside that I saw, but he was there. My pulse quickened. Did you tell the police about this? She shrugged. They didn't ask, just wanted to know if I heard anything the night she died. But I work early shifts. I was asleep by the time anything happened. I thanked her and moved on to the next apartment, then the next. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Multiple neighbors had noticed the man in the parking lot. Several had heard raised voices from her apartment, though no one could identify a second person inside. The woman directly below had complained to building management about footsteps pacing back and forth at all hours, as if someone was walking the same path over and over, wearing a groove in the floor. But it was the maintenance worker who provided the most disturbing detail. She called the office last week, he told me as we stood in the building's basement storage area. Said her locks weren't working right, wanted them changed immediately. I told her I could get to it in a few days, but she insisted it was urgent, offered to pay extra for emergency service. Did you change them? He shook his head, looking guilty. Got busy with other things, kept meaning to get back to her, but he trailed off, the implications hanging heavy between us. I left the building with more questions than answers, but also with a growing certainty that her death hadn't been random. Someone had been watching her, stalking her, making her feel unsafe in her own home. She tried to protect herself, tried to reach out, but the system had failed her. I had failed her. That evening, I found myself parked outside the building where we'd worked together, staring up at the windows of our floor. The lights were still on in several offices, people working late or perhaps avoiding going home to empty apartments. I wondered how many of them had noticed her absence, how many had even realized she was gone. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop asking questions. My hands began to shake as I read the message again. Someone was watching me now, someone who knew I'd been investigating. I looked around the parking lot, studying each car, each shadow, but saw nothing out of place. Still, the feeling of being observed crawled across my skin like insects. I drove home with my doors locked and my rearview mirror constantly checked, finally understanding the paranoia that had consumed her final weeks. But instead of deterring me, the threat only strengthened my resolve. Someone wanted me to stop looking for answers, which meant there were answers to be found. The next day, I waited until the building was nearly empty before returning to her apartment. The police seal had been removed, and the landlord had given me permission to collect any personal items before they climbed the unit for the next tenant. What he didn't know was that I had my own agenda. The apartment felt different in daylight, less oppressive, but somehow more tragic. Her belongings sat exactly where she'd left them, waiting for her return that would never come. I moved quickly to the bedroom and dropped to my knees beside the bed. The blue box was there, pushed far back against the wall where the investigators had missed it. My hands trembled as I pulled it free and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, documents, and a letter addressed to me in her careful handwriting. The photos showed the man from the parking lot, dozens of images taken through her window, documenting his surveillance of the building. The documents were copies of police reports, restraining orders, and court filings, all bearing the name of someone I'd never heard her mention. But it was the letter that made my blood run cold. If you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. The man in the photos is my ex-husband. I thought I'd escaped him when I moved here, changed my name, started over. But he found me. He always finds me. The police can't help he's one of them, knows how to work the system, how to make evidence disappear. I've tried to build a case against him, but I need someone I trust to make sure the truth comes out if something happens to me. I chose you because you see people, really see them. You noticed when I was scared even when I tried to hide it. Please don't let him get away with this. The storage unit key is taped under the kitchen sink. Unit number is written on the back of the photo with the red X. Everything you need is there. I sat back on my heels, the letter shaking in my hands. She'd been planning for her own death, gathering evidence, preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. And she'd trusted me to finish what she'd started. The storage unit was across town, in a facility that looked like it had seen better decades. Her unit was small, cramped, but filled with boxes of meticulously organized evidence. Phone records showing hundreds of calls from blocked numbers, screenshots of threatening messages, medical records documenting injuries she'd claimed were accidents, a journal detailing years of abuse, escape attempts, and his relentless pursuit. But the most damning evidence was a recording device, small enough to hide in a pocket, containing hours of conversations. I plugged it into my laptop and listened to his voice for the first time, calm, controlled, utterly without remorse, as he described in detail what he would do to her when he found her. "You can't hide forever," his voice whispered through my speakers. "I know where you work, where you shop, who you talk to. That neighbor of yours, the one who's been asking about you, maybe I should pay them a visit too." The recording was dated just days before her death. I copied everything, uploaded files to cloud storage, made multiple backups. Then I sat in my car outside the storage facility, trying to decide what to do next. Going to the police seemed logical, but how could I trust them when her own research suggested he had connections within the department? How could I be sure my evidence wouldn't disappear the same way hers had? My phone buzzed again, last warning. This time I was ready. I'd installed a tracking app that morning, one that would record my location and send alerts to multiple contacts if I didn't check in regularly. If something happened to me, at least there would be a trail. But as I drove home, I realized the true horror of her situation. She'd been living with this fear for years, never knowing when he might appear, never able to trust that the people meant to protect her actually would. She died alone, despite her careful preparations, despite her attempts to reach out. The detective's office was in a building that smelled of coffee and disappointment. He looked tired when I arrived, his desk buried under case files and empty takeout containers. When I placed the blue box in front of him, his expression shifted from mild interest to sharp attention. "Where did you find this?" Where she told me to look. I handed him the letter, watched his face change as he read. She knew she was going to die. She spent months preparing for it. He listened as I walked him through everything I'd discovered, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just taking notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "This is going to be complicated," he said finally. "If her allegations are true, if he really is connected to law enforcement, then we're going to have to be very careful about how we proceed." "You believe her?" "I believe the evidence, and I believe that someone wanted you to stop looking for it." He gestured toward my phone. "Have you reported the threatening messages?" I shook my head. I wasn't sure who to trust. "Smart, from now on, you don't go anywhere alone. You don't talk to anyone about this case except me, and if you get any more messages, you call me immediately." I left his office feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. The truth was finally coming to light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now walking the same dangerous path that had led to her death. That night I dreamed of her voice humming those old songs, the melody drifting through my apartment like a ghost seeking rest. I woke with tears on my cheeks and the absolute certainty that justice, when it came, would be too little and far too late. The investigation moved slowly, carefully, with the deliberate pace of people who knew they were walking through a minefield. Weeks passed before I heard anything concrete, and when the detective finally called, his voice carried a weight that told me everything I needed to know. "We found him," he said, "but he's dead. Apparent suicide 3 states away. Left a note confessing to multiple murders, including hers." I should have felt relief, closure, some sense that justice had been served. Instead, I felt empty. "Do you believe it, the suicide?" The detective was quiet for a long moment. "I believe he's dead. I believe someone wanted this case to go away quietly. Whether he killed himself or someone else decided he was a liability." He trailed off. Some questions don't have clean answers. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my apartment, thinking about the woman who trusted me with her story. Her killer was dead, but so was she, and all the evidence in the world couldn't bring her back or erase the months of terror that had defined her final chapter. Sometimes I still catch myself listening for her humming in the elevator or looking for her car in the parking lot. Sometimes I wonder if I could have saved her if I'd been paying closer attention, if I'd asked the right questions sooner. But mostly I think about the blue box under her bed and how she'd planned for her own death with the same careful attention she'd given to everything else in her life. She'd known that no one would fight for her unless she gave them the tools to do it. I keep her evidence files backed up in multiple locations, along with my own documentation of everything that followed, just in case, because the man who killed her might be dead, but the system that failed her is still very much alive. And sometimes, late at night when the building settles and the world grows quiet, I still smell her perfume in the hallway, lingering like a promise that some stories refuse to end. Equals.